Welcome everyone to this walkthrough session. Thank you for joining. Today, Miles is going to be presenting. He'll be showing us how to build a Node-RED flow using Eigen's library.
Okay, so in today's webinar, we're going to run through using Node-RED to query data from our Eigen Historian API using some sort of pre-configured function blocks for you. So you may have noticed if you've been in Node-RED recently that at the bottom we have an Eigen section. Now it's still in the early stages of development, but it's expanding rapidly and we sort of have a very initial version ready, which allows you to connect to the Historian API. So the Historian API in Ingenuity 7, this one, Historian multi-chart, and this data source allows you to query data into charts, get current values. So if you were under the hood of any of the dashboards, it's probably one of the most used APIs. It's what connects to your external historians like IP21 or Pi or our Influx database, and it has an inbuilt calculation engine, so it allows you to combine data sources, do different manipulations, and it's quite a comprehensive API. So we do have some documentation here, which I think I've showed in a previous webinar, but I'm just going to use it as reference to this talk. So basically, it's a post API. It expects a payload of a certain structure, and it allows you to get raw points, interpolated points, current point, historic point, and then a few other useful interactions as well as aggregates, which is really useful. So in postman request, if I show it to you like this, essentially what it might look like is something like this. So you'd have a base URL with a simple payload like that, and it just makes a post request. And the benefit of going through these blocks is you don't need to worry about any authentication or networking. It's sort of all handled for you under the hood. So let's drag one in. So we've got Historian Multi. So Historian Multi is quite generic. It's not a single function on top of it. So as you saw in the docs here, as you drag this widget onto a flow, you can pick your functions. You've got current points, raw points, all the way down. So each of them has a different use. So current point would give you, or the latest value of a pi tag. Raw points will give you the raw values of a tag between a start and end, and interpolated is going to give you the interpolated. And then with interpolated, you specify how many points. So if I had a tag, I might say I want 1,000 points for yesterday, and it will give me 1,000 points. And then you can adjust your count so that you could get sampled. So you could get a point per minute, point per hour, and then historical point, you can then ask for a point in the past. And then some of these are useful if you're doing more complex analysis where you wanted to do a totalizer, you want to know your point before, point after. Very useful for doing complex logic. And then your aggregates is very useful. Let's say you want to get yesterday's average, then you can just ask for that and it would give you your average, min max, standard deviation, all the fun stuff that it would do. So you might wonder, well, how do I know how to use it? So if you click on one of these, if I go to there's a little eye icon on the right here, and if I select Historian Multi, and then there's a little show help button here. So with each of these function blocks, we've provided sort of basic documentation on how to use it to get you started. With that, you're able to quickly get started using it. And then we also have that with the write to historian as well. So the write one is really useful because you can just prepare yourself a payload like this, and then you can write data to our time series databases. It will automatically create the tags, and that tag would be available for you straight away. Let's think about how one might use one of these. So in a couple of examples up here, I'll just run through them. I just go back to my debug tab. I just run this. Okay, so basically I've created just a couple of really simple flows. So this one is just going to get me the current point of this demo tag. It's just a connect to our demo system. And so you can see here that it's basically working in code. The inject could pass in things to the next function, but in this case we're not, and then we're not outputting anything. So what this function does is it goes off, it'll make the HTTP request, and then it stores it in the message object. So you can see here that in message.data, or in status first, you've got 200, which means that that request was done successfully. And then down here, you can see the response from the API that we've queried. So there's no errors. And then in results, under label, under data point, you can then see that value. So then going forward, if you wanted to access that, for example, if I had a function block in, I could drag that in. I could then say, well, how do I get that value? So I could go message dot data, dot results, and then I could go down and I could grab that value, and then I could use it later on, which is typically how you would use this going forward. And then in this case, it's just returning you a single point timestamp value. But if it was interpolated, it would give you an array of data. So you might get 1,000 different points. You can then bring that in to the next step of your flow, and then you just loop through it, or you might do some different aggregation to then drive the next step of your analysis. I'll just delete that. I'll show you the next step. So another really useful way of using it, if I double click this one, is being able to override the payload. So in this case here, we've got some simple drop downs that allow you to sort of pre-configure it to a degree, so you can get a single point. Like this one I've done, it's just current point now with this tag. But actually, if I want to do it slightly more complex, I can put this message.payload. If you've used Node-RED before, if you're using the HTTP request node, it's how you would do it there as well. So in here, then I can structure the payload however I want. So in this case here, you've got requests, tag one, and the benefit of the API is that you can bundle this in. So I could actually make 100 requests to 100 different tags. And then in my response, it's going to reference that tag one label that I've applied up here. So you see here that in the previous step, we've just defaulted it to label. So then that's how you know you get to it. But if you were using a custom flow, then up here you have full control of your request, and you could execute interpolated point, current point, raw points all in the same request to minimize load. And typically it's for Node-RED use cases, you're probably going to either run the flow every now and then when required, or you'll schedule it maybe once an hour, once a day. So it's a great way to use it. And then hopefully with these function blocks pre-configured, it'll be easier for people to sort of gain access into the data that you might be seeing on a dashboard in Ingenuity, and you can bring that into a Node-RED flow. So let's just run this one quickly. Let's delete that. You can see that ran, so status 200. And then you can see here that my results is tag one with my data points like so. So then I've got, so if I just double check what my request was, yeah, so I've said, give me 8 points from the 13th to the 20th of July 2025. And then for this demo tag here. So if I take this demo tag, I can actually, if I go into the system and trend it as well, like this one. So then, yeah, this is the tag that it's requesting, and then I could probably bump it back like that. So essentially, let's go 30 days. This is essentially the data that it's requesting. So typically in a dashboard, you're seeing it as a trend, but now you've got the data in a JSON format that you could then use for next steps. So one use case for this is that if your trigger was event-based, so you had an alert come in, take, for example, a blowdown use case, an alarm has let you know that a valve has opened, and you know all the details of the segment. So from that, you've got the pi tag or the IP21 tag for your pressure that you want to track the depressurization of the valve and the segment. So then what you could do is you set your start time to when the valve opened, and then your maybe say 30 minutes after, and then you could set your count to be, you could configure the count so that you might get a point a minute, point a second, or if you know that the tag is quite detailed, you might ask for raw, and then you could run a loop statement through that, and you could then track how long it took for the valve to depressurize sort of below 7 bar or below 50%. And then with that data, you could then store it into an object in Node and then write it somewhere else or move on to the next step. It's really useful. So the final one here is you've got the write to historian. So if I just clear that, these. So currently this is really neat because typically whenever we're doing sort of a Node-RED flow, a typical use cases is we've got a calculation that's quite intense, and we always want to store the data back in our time series database, and we're always doing it. So we want to be able to do that quickly. So basically, it works almost the exact same way as the other ones, but your payload is slightly different. So your payload would look something, it would consist of a timestamp, a status, and a value. So in this case here, what the UI gives you is the ability to do a single one, which is okay, but unlikely that you're ever going to be writing 1 point. But then you would be able to use this incoming payload, and you could write 1,000 points, 10 points, 1 point. So then it gives you that data available into your dashboard. So I could create a simulation. I could query data from an external source. I want to manipulate it a little bit, and then I can format it correctly and write that into my system. And then using this timestamp block here, I could schedule that. So for example, here it would get scheduled every minute between midnight and 1 a.m., or I want it to run every 1 second or every 5 minutes, for example. So this is something that we might do is might query, say, an API that might only give you the last 5 points, but we want to know the history of that. So you can just set a recurring task in here. You query it once every 5 minutes or once an hour, depending on the frequency, and then it would store that tag into our internal influx database, which then could be then used on different dashboards. So it'd be great for doing, say, some forecasts or some currency prices, just to give that final touch to a dashboard that you're building. One other thing here is that when writing to Historian is this option here, the create tags. So if I bring this up, when you search for a tag, this is our demo system. So demo influx DB is our demo system. And let's say that I need to write a tag to this, so we can create one live. So if I create this to be MD test 2. I assume I haven't created that before, and we'll do a point at 2020, for example. So let's just deploy that. Give it a second, and then we will run that. So then it's given us a nice message, all points written, and then let's find that tag. What did I call it again? MD test 02. So you can see that tag already exists. It's available instantly. So there's no refreshing of the cache. You don't have to wait an hour or request to IT for someone. It's just there ready, and then I can trend it. So you can see here that if I just minimize this one, let's make this red, and let's trend it. Go to 2015. It probably got upset. But yeah, there you go. You can see that we've got a point at some point. I'm not sure what day I wrote it, but basically then it could quickly access the data for that point, and the right API can accept loads of tags. We've done sort of 60,000 points. I think we've gone higher as well. So if you want to store data, or you have a simulation function running that outputs maybe a prediction for the next month at a point per minute, then you'll be able to handle it. And then of course, if you wanted to write the code slightly differently, you could then batch the request so that you can then store the data in different ways. So these functions, recently we've started using them. So before, just to show you the benefit of using this, before what you'd have to do is you would use an HTTP request node when we're doing our stuff. So I'll show you what one of those would look like. So I just copy and paste a few things. So then in here, this is where you have to configure everything quite manually. So it's just like you would do if you're using something like Postman. One, you'd specify the request type. So in this case, it'd be a post API. Then we need to pass in our URL, and then you would need to, in a function block beforehand, just like I did this, you'd need to do message.payload, and then you might need to configure any authentication headers as well, which is fine if you know all the different parameters, but for ease of use, typically everything's going to be the same against our Eigen APIs. This will make it drag and drop so that you can easily expand your Node-RED flows to include historian connections, and this library will get expanded. So we've just started with the historian API. So anyone that's used our Python library knows that we've got connectivity to the historians, but we also got our graph API, which allows you to query the Neo4j graph database. You can query the event log and write to the event log, so which is a really advanced use case. So that allows you to store events into our event database, and then you can then use those to drive different dashboards. You could do all sorts of cool visualizations using event tracks. And going back to the point I made earlier, the blowdown use case was sort of very something like this. You'd query the historian, and you capture all this external data, so all the timings to get to certain pressures, or at 50%, you might query the asset model to grab some external metadata around that. You bundle it all into a nice little JSON event, and then you post that into the database. And then once it's there, you can then use another set of APIs to then try and build an advanced dashboard. So you might want to see the latest alarm for each segment, and then you want to see the history. So we're doing something very similar with well tests using that exact same method. So just to recap, so they're on the sidebar here. And then to get the documentation, to just get a bit more info, you have to press this eye icon up here and then this little show help, which is the same procedure to access the help for all of the other Node-RED icons. But yeah, that's just where it is. It's slightly a little bit hidden, and then in there, it should give you just enough detail to get you started. And then if you have any other questions while using that, then yeah, please raise a question to support and we'll always be happy to help. And then if you have any other questions regarding Node-RED, if you go on to their help here, they have a full documentation guide on using it and sort of explaining on how you can then grab relevant bits of information to use in the next stages of your flow. But to recap, everything is done on this message object, the simple flows. So if you were making multiple requests and you wanted to persist that information down to use later on, you just need a post-processing block here. So for example, let's do it now, actually, it's a good example. So we take this one, I think it was message.data. So then I could do, if I go node.warn message.data, then, but yeah, that will allow you to then grab that piece of data and then store it in another variable. So because when you run a request from one to another, this data would get overwritten. So if I had two requests back to back, this data field at the very end of your flow in this debug statement, that data is going to be gone. It'll be the second one. So you just have to remember to do that post processing afterwards. And the benefit of using these module blocks is that when they output any errors, they are compliant with our support monitoring. So if the API failed or it's sort of throttling or something like that, then we'll see an alarm up on our system and we'll be able to help diagnose and fix it for you. So I think that's it for this afternoon. It's quite a short topic, but it's a very powerful feature. If anyone's got any questions, then please go ahead. Otherwise, feel free to email me or email support during the week.